Hello. So I just wanted to make a quick impromptu video here, just talking about like textures and their role with GPU memory. Because I just got off a call with a studio that was having render issues. They were having memory issues with their movie render queue renders, and it's a pretty frequent call that I end up having with kind of studios who are new to using Unreal Engine for like VFX or linear animation. Kind of in the beginning, I always end up kind of starting to talk to them about like just general optimization and scene optimization, and they kind of have this assumption that since they don't necessarily care about real-time renders, they don't like they don't care about 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. They're fine with 30 second per frame renders coming out of movie render queue. They think that they don't necessarily have to play by the same optimization rules, and they could not be more wrong. Anyway, so and then all the time, like a few weeks later, I get a call or an email from them saying help, our renders are crashing, our scene is slow, and we don't know what's going on. Renders crashing at a movie render queue due to memory issues, like 95% of the time, it's because of textures. So I just wanted to, kind of make a quick video where we talk about, kind of textures and their role in the whole thing, and just, kind of the whole process. So when you bring a texture into Unreal Engine, let's just go grab a checkerboard real quick. It just kind of plops in there, right? And I think people get this like false sense of security because there's no like GUI pop-up where you have different, kind of import choices. Right? Unreal Engine tries to make a lot of choices for you. And they might not necessarily be the right choices. They might not necessarily be the choices that you want. I mean, it does its best, right? So, you should follow this up, right? And have a look at this. So, kind of first things first, right? Like, when UE brings, or when you bring a texture into UE, right? Like there's this texture here, the source file at the bottom, checker underscore srgb.png. So it's not a PNG anymore when it's in Unreal Engine. It's Unreal Engine makes a U asset out of this, right? So inside the U asset is the source pixels. In case you ever wanted to, export this thing back out, you can get back out exactly what you put in. So the source pixels and all of the MIPS generated are held in the DDC, right? So that's here. So it's a U asset now. It's no longer a PNG. It's no longer EXR. It's no longer a JPEG. So it's all held in the DDC. So when you're syncing from Perforce and you're syncing DDC and it takes a long time, it's because you're syncing all your textures, all the source pixels, and then all of the MIPS, right? Now, we'll get to MIPS in a second, but let's just have a look in here at kind of choices that Unreal Engine has kind of made for you, and make sure that you want those choices. The first thing, and I see this wrong all the time, is Srgb, right? I mean, I'm not going to explain color space till here. I mean, everybody has a good handle on it, but most times Unreal Engine will default a map to Srgb, right? And you should make sure that you want the map to be represented in Srgb space in the engine. Like a rule of thumb, like base colors, colored spec maps, colored emissive maps, those should be Srgb. Like anything where you want the color of that texture to be represented, as a color in your render, they should be Srgb. I see, it wrong mostly on pack maps, like, when like, red is roughness map and green is height map and blue is AO map or whatever. I always see Srgb on, right? So let's go grab a colored checkerboard here if I can find one. Okay, so let's say this is your pack map, right? And you have your different you have your different grayscale maps in your different channels. Like you're gonna plug the red channel into roughness. You're gonna plug the green channel into whatever you're gonna plug into. By default, Unreal Engine thinks that this is an sRGB map, right? And you don't want this to be an sRGB map. Like you want the values of these pixels to be proper. You don't want them converted. So you want this map to be a linear map, right? And if you're like in a scene and you're trying to like light this table, right? And this like spec highlight, it's just not reacting the way that you think it should react. Like everything's just kind of flat and not dynamic and really weird, and you're just really struggling with the material. I would go in here, right, and have a look that like these maps are in the proper color space, right? So like the pack map, you want in linear space. The normal map, you want in linear space. The color map, you want in sRGB space. I see this all the time. So, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with memories or crashing or anything. I just want to bring this up because I see it all the time. Anyways, so let's get back up to here and, kind of what we were talking about, what Unreal Engine does when it brings in a UE and it makes the UE set, right? It's got the source pixels and then it has MIPS, right? So you see the MIPS up here, 12 MIPS are made. So now, what's a MIP, right? A MIP, for each MIP level, Unreal Engine is going to scale it by half on X and Y, right? So this is 1024 by 1024, right? This is 512 by 512. There's MIP 2, 256 by 256, MIP 3, 128. And it, goes all the way down until it gets to 12 MIPS or like, probably like a 1 by 1. Yeah, there it is, a 1 by 1, right? So, this doesn't have to be square. This can be like a rectangular, right? So if this is like if this is 2048 by 1024, that works fine. It used to be the case in 5.0 and in UE4 where if your texture wasn't, if the texture resolution wasn't authored in a power of 2 up here, then Unreal Engine would not make MIPS. It's in 5.1, they made it so it will make MIPS. So like if this texture resolution was authored and it was like 513 by 513 or something like that, it would still make MIPS for you. What it's going to do is it's just going to pad the pixels up to the next power of 2, right? So if it was 513 by 513, it's going to be 1024 by 1024. So it's going to be the same amount of memory on your GPU as a 1024 by 1024 texture, but you're not going to get the extra pixel resolution out of it, right? So you might as well just author your textures in Power of 2, which most studios do, which is fine. Okay, so, why does UE make MIPS, right? And why does it want MIPS? So Unreal Engine strives for how do I say this correctly? It strives for a 1-to-1 rendered pixel to texel density ratio, right? So like if in your rendered frame, if this was like 256 by 256 in your rendered frame, Unreal Engine would prefer to load a 256 by 256 texture for this. Like in a perfect world, that's what's happening, is it's representing the pixels 1-to-1. So, not only if you have streaming turned on, which we'll get to that later, then, it's great for memory. But, if you had a, 2000 by 2000 texture jammed in here, it would potentially flicker frame to frame, right? It would potentially pixel fight. Or if it was smaller than that, then it would stretch, right? It would get scaled and stretched. So, UE kind of, tries to load in the right MIP for it. Sorry, there's a fire outside of my house somewhere. So those are MIPS, right? Now, don't get confused. There's this thing called streaming virtual textures, which is kind of like Niagra for textures, for lack of a better term, right? Where it will break up this one like textured MIP in 128 by 128 tiles. So like, let me see, what's the best way to do this? Let me see if I can draw. I'm gonna draw with a mouse. So it's gonna break these up in tiles. I can't even draw a straight line with a mouse. In 128 by 128 tiles, right? And what the advantage is, excuse me, and what the advantage is, you know, instead of just loading, you know, MIP1 here for this whole thing, right? It's only going to load MIP1 for these things, and then it could load MIP, you know, 2 for these, and then load MIP3 for these, and load MIP4 for these. You know, so you don't need to get, you know, just one whole texture MIP for the whole object, right? So it's incredibly performant in memory, and it's, you know, and it's also can better keep that 1-to-1 pixel to texel density ratio. Another thing that's really good is like, you know, in the case of this, right, there's something blocking this edge of the table down here. So for the things that it's being blocked by, like these tiles, it's just going to load in a super low resolution of that tile, right? Like say for this chair, like if this was all virtual textures, like everything that's under here, it's just going to load in a super low res tile. And for like if you want to use UDIMs, streaming virtual textures are a must. Like you can't have UDIMs without streaming virtual textures. So it's a good thing. We used to like dissuade people from using streaming virtual textures in especially with moving render queue, because like if there was a camera move, like a fast camera move, or if there was like a character that came, you know, kind of running into frame, or you cut and there was a character there, it could potentially take UE like a frame or two to figure out what you know, like what resolution of tile it needs to load in. So you could potentially see like for a frame or two, you know, UE like, you know, updating this tile to the proper resolution, right? And you know, it was a problem. What in 5.1 there's going to be something called cinematic pre-streaming. It's a plugin. It's experimental, but it's a plugin. We use it on the Matrix Awakens demo. So if you go into Movie Render Queue, there's this pre-streaming recorder, and basically it'll go through and kind of like cache what virtual texture bucket you know, versions it needs for the shot. So it'll kind of like pre-cache it all, for lack of a better term. And then, you know, it kind of already knows what versions that it needs when it goes to render out of Movie Render Queue, rather than trying to figure it out on the fly. So in 5.1, that should be fixed. Okay, so that's MIPS, right? Let's go back here and have a look. The next thing that I want to have a look at here is compression, right? And this is a big one. So you see your resource size here. That's going to be the amount of memory that this texture takes up on your GPU when you send this thing to render, right? So if you go down here and you look at compression, we'll see, you know, there's a bunch of different choices for compression, and this is well documented. Like, you know, this is all in the docs, and there's a bunch of videos about compression and all these different compression types. But the default here is BC1. Like, you'll see this in most of the textures in Unreal Engine, and it's a great compression. So this is 8 times smaller than a uncompressed texture, right? And then for, you know, some like for some better quality, There's this BC5, right? But if you look up here, it's double the size. So it's 4 times smaller than a uncompressed texture. And then there's, kind of different ones, like you see grayscale quite a bit, you see mask quite a bit, normal maps quite a bit. Now, why does this matter, right? Because, as I said before, this is the amount of memory that it's going to take up on your GPU, right? And if you only have 4 gigs, 8 gigs of memory on your graphics card, then 21 megs for a 2K checkerboard is a lot, right? That's a lot. And people will kind of get picky about like roughness maps and normal maps, especially. And if you're it's like, if this is your shot and you have this really delicate, intricate kind of roughness map, and you're seeing compression with with BC1, and you want to switch it to either BC7 or grayscale, sure, go ahead, totally. But I just want to have a look, right? Let's see, what's a good, here you go, this is probably a good one to see it on. So let's have a look, right, at what's happening. So this is a 4K, this is a 4K grayscale map, right? It's got BC1 compression, and it's 11 megs, right? And you zoom in here, and you do see some compression. If you switch this to BC7, right, it gets a little better, right? I mean, it's definitely better. And if you switch this to grayscale, right, versus BC7, it's kind of the same. But if you look up here, grayscale is 87 megs, right? BC7 is 22 megs. BC1 is 11 megs. So, if you're seeing this texture in your render to this scale, yeah, sure. But if you're seeing the texture in your render to this scale, are you seeing any compression difference? Are you seeing any textural difference? And it's like, let's see if we can go find this, right? What is it? It looks like a blanket or something. Here it is. Okay, right? So it's this pillow, right? Let's say you have like a shot where a character is sitting there talking, right? If you go from here to here, do you see a difference at all? And this is 87 megabytes versus 11 megabytes sitting on your GPU. I say this all the time, when people think that they don't have to optimize their scene. This all has to fit on your GPU. Any frame that you want to render, everything has to fit on your GPU all at once. Like, there's no delayed load, there's none of that stuff. It all has to fit. All of your geometry has to fit. All of your textures have to fit. All of your effects have to fit. Everything has to fit on your GPU. And if it doesn't fit on your GPU, then your renders are going to crash, or Unreal is going to crash. Right? So, texture compression matters. It really matters. Like, don't just, take it for granted. Now, another thing that I wanted to bring up, especially when it comes to texture compression, is EXRs, right? Because, most studios that I worked at, like, maybe all, except for Rhythm Use, but EXRs were like the standard image format, right? Either for HDRs and for texture maps and for renders and comp renders. I mean, EXRs were just the standard format that everything was held in. So let's bring a half-float checkerboard into Unreal Engine, right? So there's nothing wrong with bringing in an EXR in Unreal Engine. It will import in just as fast and efficiently as a PNG, as a JPEG. It will convert over into UAsset. It's not like it takes any longer to do that stuff. It's just as fast. But when we double click it and we bring it in, right? So this is a 2K checkerboard, right, are as a EXR. This is almost 44 megabytes. Our 2K checkerboard as a PNG was 3 megabytes, right? Okay, well, why? If you look at this compression setting, this is set to HDR compression. So any EXR that you bring into Unreal Engine is going to assume that, one, you want high dynamic range, and you might, if you have a spec map or something, or a pack map or a mask map, do you want high dynamic range? I mean, that's up to you. But just be aware that it thinks that you want high dynamic range in a very, in a very low compression file, right? Which is up to you. But, again, like, we just brought it in and it was fine, and you loaded it up in your material and you hit render and it looks fine. So people just don't follow it up. So, even if you did want high dynamic range, you can come in here and go to HDR compressed and look at this, 5 megs versus the default 43 megs, right? Like, let's grab, like, not even a checkerboard. What's something that we can, this can't be all the textures, is it? Yeah, okay. So here's a translucency map, right? So these are leaves. These are leaves in the scene, right? And let's say that this is an EXR. Don't worry about the color change. Let's say that this was an EXR and this was brought in, like, right, it was kicked out of your pipeline as an EXR and it was published. So this is 175 megabytes. 175 megabytes for a leaf texture. And if you have a 4 gigabyte card, an 8 gigabyte card, 175 megs for a leaf for a leaf albedo map is a huge investment. It's a huge investment, right? And it's a huge investment that you might not be aware that you're making. I mean, whatever. Let's zoom in here and let's go to HDR compressed versus HDR, right? I mean, you see a little bit of stuff, especially out here. But I mean, this is probably even outside the UV borders, right? So HDR compressed. I mean, let's really move in here versus HDR. It's ridiculous. 175 megs versus 22 megs, right? And if you, and if it's like that for every single texture in your project, I mean, think about how much memory you're leaving on the table. And it's like, this is nothing, right? This is nothing for a project. Like, this is nothing even for most scenes. I mean, this is a very controlled indoor scene, right? Think about if you had some sort of like epic, outdoor environment, right? This is what, 200 textures maybe, right? I mean, projects have thousands and thousands and thousands of textures. And if you're not following up on your compression here, then you're going to have a bad time, right? Like, your memory is going to fill up and your renders are just going to crash. And, which is a good time to talk about streaming, right? Streaming textures. Because, most people, when I tell them that, they'll say, okay, well, why, right? Like, why does Unreal Engine do that? When you have streaming turned off, so let me talk about the difference between streaming and non-streaming your textures, right? So when you have streaming turned off, which in Movie Render Queue, it is, by the way, right? By default, it's turned off. Most people don't realize at first that even though this game overrides, where is it? Even though this is not active in the GUI, it's still controlling your render, right? So if you look at here, by default, texture streaming is turned off. It says disable streaming. So what's texture streaming versus not streaming? When you're not texture streaming, right? And UE goes into the shot and it says that it wants to run a shot, right? And it says, okay, this is, X amount of pixels inside your render, or X amount close to camera, I want MIP 1 for this, I want MIP 7 for this, I want MIP 10 for this to keep that 1-to-1 ratio, right? So it's going to load all of those MIPS onto GPU to render, but it's also going to load every other MIP, right? So it's going to load MIPS 0 through 12 for this chair, 0 through 12 for this table, 0 through 12 for this radiator. It's going to load every single texture and every single MIP for everything in your frame onto your memory card. And it will do that without any sort of safety. Like, if there's not enough room on your GPU to load every single MIP for every single object in your render scene, then UE is just going to crash, right? Your GPU is going to get overwhelmed and UE is going to crash. So you see where, compression, makes compression makes a huge deal, right? Where like, I don't even know if it shows. Oh, anyways, resource size, right? If this is the case for every single texture, you're saving 150 megs for every single texture. And let's say, again, this is a very controlled scene. Like, what if you had some sort of, outdoor or exterior, and there was like, 1,000 objects in your scene, and every map was this like huge 4K HDR. Compression really, really, really matters. So that's not streaming, right? And you see how potentially, GPUs can get overwhelmed, right? Just by textures. So then, it begs the question, okay, why? Why do that, and why have that default in Movie Render Queue, right? Is because it's faster. It's faster for your render, right? It's like, so remember how we, kind of talked about, okay, everything in here is loaded into memory, right? And then the camera pulls around here and it loads everything into memory, right? Well, depending on how fast this is, kind of happening, Unreal Engine can take like a frame or two to, kind of figure out like, okay, this chair is here and it's this density. So I want, MIP 0 and to load MIP 0 and to put it on the chair and to render it. So sometimes, you can see it figuring that out in your rendered frame, which is not good, right? So people turn streaming off, and it's like, okay, all of these things are already in memory, so it's a lot faster to pull that MIP, put it on there, and render it, rather than going and digging it out of your DDC, loading it onto your GPU, and then rendering it, right? And if you have the room on your graphics card, then, why not, right? Like, I've got, let's see here, I've got, 48 gigs, yeah, go to town. But if you've got a lot of textures, or you have smaller graphics cards, then it could be problematic, right? So then, people say, okay, well, why can't Unreal Engine just, have some sort of failsafe where, it won't just try and load every texture and every MIP in view and crash my render, right? So we do, and it's called texture streaming. So texture streaming in the project is normally enabled by default. Texture streaming here. So what's the difference between streaming and non-streaming, right? So we are talking about non-streaming, how it's going to load everything. Texture streaming is only going to load the MIPS that it wants into memory and render it, right? So it's going to go, okay, MIP 0, MIP 1, MIP 2, MIP 10, whatever. And it's only going to load those MIPS onto your GPU into memory to render. Now, you run the chance of, seeing a lower resolution MIP for a frame or two in here if you have a really fast camera move, like a really fast camera move. It's, Unreal Engine's pretty good at being predictive. So, it's not like you're just going to see that all the time. But if you have a really fast move, or you have something that like really appears on screen, or if you run into memory pool issues, which we should talk about memory pools next, then you could potentially see that, right? So, but, you know, most times when you see that in your render, it's a issue with your memory pool. And a lot of people don't manage their memory pools, which they should. So, you know, I'm sure everybody has seen like that, you know, over allocated red, you know, kind of texture error. Let's see if we can get it to. By the way, this is the new console variable tool that came out in 5. If you're not using it, you should use it because it's awesome. Anyways, so I just set the streaming memory pool size to, I think it's like 10 megabytes or something. So we're over allocated now, right, by 1.287 gigs. Okay, what does that mean, right? So basically, a memory pool is a dedicated allocation on your memory, on your GPU, right? Unreal Engine is saying, okay, you know, I've got whatever 2 gigs of GPU memory that I'm going to use for textures, right? And as soon as you fill that up, you know, it's not going to let you load any more, right? It's not going to let you fill up your GPU. So this is streaming, right? So what's going to happen if you fill it up? Like if you run out of memory, like let's say in this instance here, right? You see that we have this warning here. If we crank this up, you know, what it's going to do is it's going to start loading in lower res MIPS than it wants to, right? So once you hit that you know, kind of memory pool, let's see if we can force it. It's not going to be forced today. Anyways, what it'll do is, like, once you hit that memory budget, is instead of loading in MIP1 for this, it'll load in MIP2. And instead of loading in, you know, MIP10 for this, it'll load in MIP12. So it'll keep going down lower and lower and lower resolution until it can load in all the textures that it wants to use for that render, right? So it's not going to crash, and it's not just going to like not load textures for other objects. It'll just start throttling down all of your MIPS, right? So it'll basically just start, you know, biasing all of your MIPS down, saying like, okay, you know, for MIP 0, I'm going to load MIP 2, right? So that's what's going to happen when that memory pool fills up, right? It's not going to crash. You can get you can see where you are, get like a holistic view of your streaming and memory pool just by typing stat streaming. You know, so you can kind of see like how much you're over allocated, right? Like here's the required pool. This is how much of your memory you're actually using. You know, so you can kind of look at it here and manage your memory pools. So this can be managed by a CVAR. This is tied to scalability. Let's see here. We could probably see this. So if you go to textures and you go to Epic, right? So let me make sure that that's not what I'm doing. So if you go to, Epic is set to 1,000. If we go down high, you'll see the pool size go to 800, and then if you go to cinematic, right, you'll see it go to 3,000. So pool size is set to engine scalability automatically. If you look at movie render queue, again, in the game overrides, you're forcing cinematic quality settings. So movie render queue is forcing this pool size. So you can always override this in movie render queue if you want. R.streaming.pool size equals whatever. So you can override that in movie render queue. But they're set in the default scalability, right? So you can set what these things for your whole project, and you should set it for the whole project, because in my experience, like for linear VFX and linear animation, the pool sizes are set are really conservative by default. Like they're pretty conservative. Like most people, they don't necessarily have A6000s, but they've got better cards. Like this is set for the masses, right? And this is and like a lot of these defaults are set with like gaming in mind. So anyways, so let's talk about what happens when the camera's moving around, right? Because we talked about the memory pool, and it either can or cannot load every MIP resolution that it wants to for this render, right? If there's room in the memory pool, then it can, great, and you won't get this error. If you cannot load it, then you'll get that error, and it'll start loading in lower and lower resolution MIPS. So now, let's say you've set this to like, whatever, like a ton, right? So it's loaded in this and it has room to spare, right? And then your camera goes over here and it's loaded in, this frame as well, and it still has room to spare. So just because this camera has moved over here, it's not like all of the MIPS from this frame have been ejected from your GPU, right? They're still hanging around in memory because you have room in your pool size. And what if the camera quickly goes back here, right? It's just faster to keep this in on your GPU. So, but let's say, you were over here and you loaded everything up, and then you move over here and, it gets to, it doesn't go like this, but like, let's say it gets to the top half of the frame and boom, it's run out of pool size, right? What's going to happen then? So what it's going to do is it's going to look into the pool and say like, oh, okay, what's the texture that hasn't been accessed in a while, right? Like what's the oldest texture hanging around that has, I don't know how to say it, like that hasn't been accessed in the longest amount of time, right? Let's say there was something over here and this hasn't been accessed in 15 frames. This hasn't been accessed in 10 frames, and they need this right now. So what it's going to do is it's going to eject this from memory, and it's going to load this, right? So it's not going to crash. It's just going to eject things that it hasn't accessed, and then load the new stuff. So you see where if you have a really low, like if you have a really low pool size, not only are you potentially not letting it load the MIPS that it wants to load, you're not kind of giving it a buffer, right? Like you're not kind of giving it a texture memory size buffer, right? To be able to hang on to things that will potentially show up in your shot again. So people complain about streaming because of those reasons, right? Because they see blurry textures, because they see, because the render wants MIP 1 for this, but it doesn't have enough room in the pool size, and it loads in MIP 10. And then, also they complain about streaming just because, it's like if you have a very fast camera move, just like I was saying, it could take a frame or two for, this chair to figure itself out. And, like if you have a shot and like this chair is just being problematic, and either you're, kind of out of memory or you've upped your pool size and blah, blah, blah. You just, you've done everything you think you can do, and that chair is just being a problem for some reason. Just, go into the texture for that chair and just hit never stream, right? Instead of nuking the whole project by like, shutting texture streaming off, just go cherry pick that one thing. So, you know, I mostly recommend, like, you know, I recommend to people, unless you have a smaller scene, or you have a humongous graphics card. Um, you know, I normally recommend to people, you know, go and hit don't override, keep your texture streaming, but just make sure that you set your pools. And again, you could get you can get a look at that by stat streaming. Um, you know, another good kind of troubleshooting tool that I use all the time is statistics. You just set this to texture stats if it's not already. So, like, you know, whenever I get a client project that I'm trying to troubleshoot, the first thing that I do is I pop in here, right? And like you'll see, like, some things will pop up here at the top that'll just be like, you know, glaringly wrong. It'll be like, you know, 16K by 12K, and it's got no compression, and it's you know, like, it's taking up all this memory, right? So right now you can see that, you know, 1.35 gigabytes is being taken up. And if you see like this, there will be like a compression like BC8, G8, R8, whatever. That means uncompressed. And you know, oh yeah, there you go, right? So look at all these uncompressed, and people use uncompressed on purpose, like, you know, for any sort of like HUD or GUI or UI, they want uncompressed. And so here's this like cathedral wall frame. It's 1600 by 1001. So this won't compress. The engine will not compress this because most game engines compress things on like 2x2 or 4x4 blocks, right? So if your resolution isn't 2x2 or 4x4, it just can't compress it, right? So it just won't compress it. Another thing to bring up, this is just kind of like a whatever point. So with pack maps, people, you know, are being super efficient with pack maps, right? Where, like, you know, you're packing things in the red channel, and you're packing things in the green channel, and you're packing things in the blue channel, and it's all one map, and it's great. People sometimes get super efficient, and they pack something else in the alpha channel. So alpha channels in Unreal Engine will not compress, right? So you can use that to your advantage, where, like, you know, you have stuff in your RGB channels that you want compressed, and you want something in your alpha channel that you don't want compressed. But alpha channels never compress. So, you know, if you're making pack maps, you know, you can consider, you know, kind of do your own test, but consider anything that you put in the alpha channel, it may be better off putting in a different pack map. But they don't compress. Anyways, yeah, you know, go in here and get a look at your scene, right? Like, you see, you know, all of these different kind of compression formats, right? Like, have a, you know, like, have a look, and you can even, you know, kind of go grab these things they highlight, and you can go check them out, right? And you see, hey, what's going on here, right? This is set to grayscale, obviously, right? They probably wanted something for the floor. But, you know, again, it's 21 megs versus 10 megs. So, you know, it's up to you. So, yeah, like, when I'm troubleshooting client scenes, like, the first thing that I do is I pop this thing in here, and I start to look for, like, these, you know, like, glaringly obvious issues with, like, with textures. So yeah, you know, I would, unless you have a small scene or a big card, I would turn on streaming. You know, like, when you're rendering, you know, I would keep an eye on your GPU here. You know, every once in a while, just, you know, go have a look, see how you're doing. Like, if it's starting to get up near the top, like, once your memory card starts to fill up, like, all bets are off with Unreal Engine. Like, it's just, you know, either you're going to crash or just weird things are going to happen. Like, once you get high, you know, I would consider turning on texture streaming, mess with your pool sizes. If you're doing virtual textures, you set the pool, it's got a different pool size. So if you go into the docs, this will tell you how to set your pool size for virtual textures. That's another thing that kind of gets people, is they turn on virtual textures they see blurry textures and they blame virtual textures, and they're like cranking this, right? They're like cranking this number and they blame virtual textures, but virtual textures has a different pool size. Everything's has a pool in Unreal Engine, and the more you end up working with it, the more you'll kind of see these things. So hopefully that's kind of enlightening, and it gives you like a holistic view on what's happening with textures and how they're being loaded, how they're being processed, how they're being loaded on the GPU, and why kind of optimization and color space and MIPS and compression, why all this stuff is very important, and why you should absolutely follow this thing back up. Don't just drag it in the engine and hit save and push it up to P4, because when you have big projects, and there's 10, 20, 30 people all jamming stuff into the project, and some people are experienced with Unreal Engine and some people are not, this can get unruly fast, right? You have like uncompressed textures, you have crazy resolutions, you have things set to never stream, you've got things get nuts, right? Things get crazy. And just like I said, I mean, this this amount of textures here is nothing. This is nothing compared to projects. It's like if you're doing a Netflix series, this is nothing. You're gonna have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of textures. So stay on top of it, right? If you stay on top of it, then you're gonna render quickly and efficiently, and you're gonna be able to work inside the engine quickly and efficiently, and you're just gonna have a better time all around. So I'll type all this up and put this on the Dev Hub, in kind of a more coherent manner. But I just wanted to make this video real quick, just because I have this conversation over and over and over again, and hopefully it can save at least one or two people out there that are struggling with memory with their renders. So if you have a question or whatever, just feel free to drop a comment, or just hit me up, and I'll try and help you out as best I can. All right, have a good one.